3. Free the feminine in you.
Expectations is like damage to me. The idea of having to go beyond what you're being told has been instilled in me from a very young age.
Welcome to Black Manifesto, the 10 Commandments. Black Women Speak Out, a podcast series hosted by Nora, chipaumire, and myself, Pawlet Brookes. Black Manifesto brings together voices of Black women from around the world as a collective conversation, making the invisible visible and addressing how we work to reshape a new world in which Black women are seen and heard. The guests on this podcast share their reflections unapologetically, so please be aware of uses of strong language and references to personal struggles and traumas. In this third episode, Yinka Esi Graves explores concepts around freedom and societal expectations while she contextualizes the third commandment, free the feminine in you. So we are now on the third commandment from the manifesto, free the feminine in you. In last month's episode, we explored concepts of shape, shifting and transformation, embodying the rhythm and spirit of Bulrera. How do you best express freedom in your artistic practice, especially now on your journey of expansion and self-definition?
What a question, Paulette. Amazing. I love that you bring up Buleria because it's really complex in a way. And at the same time, it's like it holds the secret to you freeing yourself, freeing your body, expressing yourself, improvising, playing, and sort of celebrating yourself in a way. And at the same time, if I think recently, especially, I think I've discovered time almost, time and space as being the key to kind of freedom in terms of my practice. So not even necessarily. So in a sense, that can come back into the dance itself. No, the more you understand how you can play with time. So be it a rhythm in and of itself, but even just kind of thinking of it on a bigger scale, I've realized that having a space, a safe space where you can allow time to go on, where you're not limiting yourself. I think recently that's become where I've understood I felt most free, where I'm not kind of forcing and I'm not expecting anything necessarily, and I'm just allowing myself to be. And that's not easy to find, the places where we can allow ourselves to be, right?
I know, because when you think about time and space and freedom and the whole way in which your body is relaxed, and you think about how the improvisation within jazz and tap and movement and that real freedom of spirit, it really is an important space or a place to find. So as a practitioner who's constantly growing and is exceptionally introspective, would you define yourself as a bullerera now?
Interesting. So I've spent a long time kind of not feeling that I am a bailaora. So, you know, how people usually define female flamenco dancers. And I think the place I find myself in now is that I'm like, maybe I'm not a bailaora in the sense that maybe I'm other things, you know, maybe I haven't had the life experience that typically a bailaora has, who have kind of, you know, learned from a very young age. I've learned to kind of value the things that myself, having been born in England from a very young age, lived in Nicaragua, then in Guadeloupe, so this kind of Caribbean part of my life, and then sort of moving back to Europe, going to a French school, all these different existences in a strange way are also registered in my body and are part of who I am, and maybe bring something else to my dancing as well. So I think, whereas before I was always fighting maybe to this idea of what a bailaora was, I feel that at least very recently, I'm like, you know what? I don't know what it is called as yet, potentially, but I'm no longer as concerned in a way because I realize that maybe there's value in these other things that don't quite fit into what a bailaora is, you know? So I think in general, that's also my relationship with the status quo as such. It can be so damaging for us to constantly be comparing ourselves or expecting ourselves to be a certain thing that has already been defined. why can't we, especially as Black women, especially as people who have very different experiences, we have experiences that are defined by the very fact that we never fit into the status quo. So it's almost like, how can we bring a definition to that very place, as opposed to squeezing into something or to expanding into something that doesn't really value all the things that you are.
I think reframing that space is essential. And the fact that you reached a point in terms of aspiration and then realised that actually it's greater than the aspiration. I think that's a wonderful space to get within, going back to your point about freedom. So you're combining those two things and creating a new aesthetic and a new identity, a new aspiration for others. How do you enable a rethinking of thought and movement of your body in the way that it was taught, so it unpacks some of these preconceptions? Because you've talked about it, mentally in terms of that freedom, but how do you unpack that within your body?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's been one of my, and continues potentially to be one of my greatest battles, is understanding how my body moves and appreciating how my body moves. And certainly, I think recently, so I'd say again, the last 2 years, I've been able to engage with Black women dancers, so not within flamenco, but outside. So, we're here talking around the Black Manifesto, which we know is written and thought up by Nora Chipaumire, and engaging with her work and having the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with her and her practice of naka, for example. And then also, I often mention her as well, Dr. Amare, people like that who've enabled me to understand the different textures that our bodies can have, or at least that they're in search of potentially something different. So I think that's really made my body much happier, in a sense that it's felt, again, I think this sense of freedom, which comes back to me, the idea of like valuing it. So in a sense, it's enabled me to move in a way that I now feel more secure in. So maybe from the outside, somebody would say, that's always kind of been present. But I feel like maybe before, I didn't understand it to be correct, even, I would say, because I was so concerned with how it should look based on who I was seeing doing it, right? And suddenly appreciating, really feeling through it and affirming it as something that has value has made a huge difference. And that's really been in the ability of seeing and learning from people outside flamenco, and specifically Black women, I would say. And then also I've had the experience of, there's a Black flamenco dancer called El Conguito, who lives in Marseille in France. And I remember seeing him do this step, and I was like, oh my God, we have this same relationship with like our back. It was really interesting. And that again was very kind of revealing, because it only highlighted to me how little I had seen my dance. Obviously, we all have a very specific way of moving wherever we're from. However, there are certain, I'd say, a different value system almost in different Black bodies, specifically. And seeing that within the flamenco form was like, oh my goodness, okay, that's amazing. All right, that makes sense, So it's reassuring. It's almost like you've been drawing something that you felt you were sketching for a long time, and then now you're kind of drawing with you're painting it, because you're like, okay, yeah, this line does want to be here, And so in a sense, it's only helping me affirm myself. And a lot of Nora's work particularly is about the ground. And I feel like that connection to the ground has also really helped that. It's sort of like really trusting, really feeling, really, allowing as well a kind of connectivity, that's something that is born from the ground into your body and back into the ground. All of that has helped me a lot.
And that groundedness is born out of understanding oneself and living a truth. So why is it important for you to live your truth? Because that's what you're talking about.
Absolutely. I feel like I don't know how to live any other way, for good or for bad, because on one level, it's kind of, it makes life difficult sometimes when it's almost like you're asking a lot of it, that everything has to feel true to you. Everything has to feel organic to a certain extent. But I would also say that I have to give thanks to my father in this case, because from a very young age, he would offer me these books. And I love the way he did this, because he would kind of give them to me. And it might take me a few years to come around to it. But then that was always like a really significant read. And so in particular, I'm thinking of Assata Shakur's biography. I read that when I was about 15, 16. And like her life story marked me hugely. And then when I was a bit older, my father offered me Zora Neale Hurston's biography, Wrapped in Rainbows. And I had it on my shelf for years. And then I read it, I think when I'd recently moved to Madrid. And that again was like, wow, I don't know, reading these stories about these Black women who had to express themselves against all the odds, be it politically or just in terms of, all the Zora Neale Hurston's writings, her whole dedication to celebrating, exploring, learning sort of Black expression, and also her knowledge. It's almost like she knew more than those around her did. And so she was like, if I'm going to have to pretend I'm 15 years younger to do this, that's what I'm going to have to do. So that sense, a lot of people talk about nowadays of making things work for you in a non-individualistic way, because I don't see it like that. I see it as more, trusting that whatever you're doing, you're in a world that doesn't necessarily know how to see you. So you really have to work hard to be able to see yourself, to be able to speak to those who can see you or who want to see you, and kind of standing with that. So in a much smaller way, because, how dare I put myself anywhere near either Zora Neale Hurston or Assata Shakur. But I think, and even Julie Dash, I remember seeing her film Daughters of the Dust when I was really young as well. My parents took me, I think I was about 12. And just having these Black women really kind of unashamedly share their vision and their lives and their truths has been something that has inspired me since I was very young. So I never felt a sense, even though I always speak of how much of a challenge it often is, I think for me, it's almost primordial. It's almost like it's the base. And I sometimes feel like it's a bit bigger than me.
But I think it's coming from, you talk about the role that your father played in terms of your education. And it's not just about going to school. It's the education we learn as Black people. And I would say that would be echoed for me in terms of the things that I learned or that my dad passed on. And so the fact that he said, look at this, which was beyond the curriculum, look at this, which was beyond what you're being taught in dance. So you understand that research and interrogating who you are is really, really an important part of the process. And now it's become an important part of your practice. So just expand on that a little bit more, please.
Absolutely. I think the idea of having to go beyond what you're being told has been instilled in me from a very young age. That's also where I think the body is so wonderful, and that I would thank my experience with my body. I feel like it's the one that's been taking me on this journey, and it's the one that's been allowing me to learn all these extracurricular understandings, as you say, So, I mean, in terms of my practice, well, I think the body is always central for me in my practice. I'm very lucky to have a studio when I'm in Spain. And so the connecting to what my body, just trying to find its center is a daily practice in and of itself, which then obviously there's the kind of the rigor of the flamenco practice, which is kind of like doing your scales. There's a certain amount I need to do every day to be on top of that and keep expanding within that and keep improving. And then I feel it's almost project by project, I think. So obviously the Disappearing Act is the world I'm in at the moment, even though recently I've been doing other projects in collaboration with other people, with Dorothée Munyaneza, for example. And I think, even when I think of when I was at university, I'm somebody who feels like I need to kind of saturate myself. So it's not even necessarily only reading, because sometimes I don't feel like I even have the time to do as much reading as I'd like to. But I think the thinking through things is a big part of me understanding what I'm doing. And so I write quite a lot, actually. That's, for the Disappearing Act, I've written so many things, which are just kind of from notes partly on what I've read, but also just my own thinking from all parts of life, whether I'm traveling, whether it's after an improvisation. I've been doing a lot of improvisation recently with Dorothée, kind of observations that then kind of feed back into the work that I'm doing.
So in the Disappearing Act and the bridge, there's a really powerful moment of femininity, freedom, and vulnerability that was featured almost like an afterthought. Just tell us a little bit, what inspired that study.
So, I mean, whilst on one level I'm saying that I think a lot. On another level, I would say that I'm also quite visceral. And in that particular instance, it was like a necessity. It was almost like for me to really be true, because obviously in the Disappearing, I'm trying to kind of engage with these different spaces. And it was almost like you're just going to have to do this with nothing on. It felt like that was, the truest thing to do in that moment. And I'm in no way, shape, or form usually an exhibitionist. Like I'm not somebody who is used to sharing their body in that way. But it felt like there was no costume or nothing that would make sense there. It really was just about the body. And I think that this awareness that I have of how often as Black women, our bodies are either hypersexualized, there's always some sort of judgment, I think, on how we are viewed in general. That it was almost like me giving myself the opportunity to just see myself, because really this is a research project. So at the beginning, it wasn't something that was necessarily going to be viewed by other people, but really just see myself for myself, really at the beginning. And yet now I'm aware, because obviously you can't see my face, that now it's almost like a body that's not even mine. And I think it was, almost like an act of love as well, of just being and allowing my body to be there, and let it kind of, all the kind of the opening of the arms, the expansion, the opening of the chest, all these sorts of like delicate movements that also are very pleasurable to experience, to do. And so it's like a little ode at the same time, next to the violence that is so often perpetuated on our bodies.
But it was almost like you talked about the freedom at the beginning, and it was freedom, it was space, it was vulnerability, it was, all these things. And it was like breaking stereotypes and taboos and all trying to capture all of those in a really sort of small moment in time. And given that then, so how do you strive to push yourself outside of the comfort zone? Because as you said, you didn't intend to be that free, but yet within that moment in time, within that piece, you just had to say, right, I'm taking off the shackles. How were you able to be that brave? How did you do that?
That's an interesting question. I think I have to say I'm very lucky that I was being filmed by my husband, and I think that makes a big difference. And coming back to this question of a safe space, knowing who we are surrounded by, who are supporting us, who are enabling us to have that space, who we know aren't judging us. And even recently working with Dorote Munyaneza, again, she's created a piece, Mai, where we are 6 Black women who have so much love for each other. And the space that she created for us to create in was one of kind of support and openness. So I think on that level, that's becoming more and more important to me. It's almost like who is standing around, who is holding, who is joining in this moment, in this process that allows us, that allows me the space again, the space to do whatever needs to be done in a sense, because I think I'm sure had I been in another setting, even if my gut would have been like, you need to take everything off and just do it, I probably wouldn't have felt able to, because so many times we're censoring ourselves because of also sometimes what we think other people might see or so on and so forth. So I think that's been very interesting and important to discover, that it's like, wow, it makes all the difference. So how can I make that a constant? At the moment, that's my thing, is like, how can I make this space of like safety a constant as much as possible, when so many other spaces I've been working in have not been that? It's been almost the opposite. So I haven't felt as able to explore and expand.
Given that safety as a constant, if I was just going to ask you about your sort of relationship with 3 words as a sort of as a provocation, so expectations, body, and voice. How does that all link in with safety as a constant? You're sort of talking about that as well, because you're saying you don't know what the preconceived ideas are of others, which then can restrict, you know, and those expectations are the preconceived ideas that you think they have about your body. And then those preconceived ideas that one might have and the voices within that. But then you've just said safety is really important. So throwing that in, what is the relationship with all of these and how does that work for you? Because there's got to be an interrelationship with all of that.
Expectations is like damage to me. We all have them. They are there, whether they're imposed by society, whether they're imposed by us because we've also believed society, and it's hard not to so often. But I think that unfortunately, at least in my experience, they've often been very damaging in the sense that that only causes judgment when I think that we need to allow, you know, we need to allow. And in terms of bodies, I feel I'm like, again, for me, I'm thankful. You know, I think I'm somebody who I've moved around a lot as a child. We lived in different countries. So I'm very mobile. I never feel attached. You know, I listen to other people and they definitely feel they belong to a particular country or space and so on. And that's something that I know I don't feel because of my experience. But my body, I think more and more is the place. And I think that's for so many Black people. This is the place that we've owned when other people have often owned us. Or if, in fact, in times when we haven't owned it, that is still the place that we most have ownership of, right? And for me, I think inhabiting it as fully as I can, or I'm trying to learn to, is almost what I most aspire to, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think, you know, bodies are such a contentious space. The bodies of Black women are such contentious spaces as well, in terms of how they are mistreated and how we often mistreat ourselves. You know, I'm really intrigued in how we transform ourselves to fit into the status quo. What is it that we're doing to our skin, to our hair, to all these things to find ourselves more attractive, acceptable, so on and so forth. And so it is a battleground, be it literal, you know, thinking of like, you know, Breonna Taylor or Sandra Bland, people like that, literally losing their lives, or much more subtly, you know, the thousands and millions of us across the globe who are taking part in these small acts of violence, as I see it in some ways. So I think the body's huge. It's so important. And I feel like I'm on an attempt to honor it as much as possible. And with the comfort zone thing, through the body, I feel like that's the place through which, because I think I've often been in uncomfortable spaces. You know, I've often gone to places that I don't necessarily belong in, as you mentioned, you know, me coming into the flamenco world. I've often placed my body in places where it maybe shouldn't have been. However, through this kind of recent appreciation of connecting deeper inside the body, I feel like that is the place for real expansion, if that makes sense. That it's almost like through the body that I can allow myself to push further into different comfort zones as opposed to putting my body in an uncomfortable zone, if that makes sense. So, voice, I mean, knowing what we want to say, like if we, you know, we're talking about our voices at the moment, we're talking about us being heard, you know, because as Nora is saying, we're like the bottom of the bottomless. And at the same time, it feels like, what is it that we want to say, really? And I think to ourselves as well and to each other. At the moment, I have a big question about who we're speaking to and what we're saying. So it's like, you know, are we speaking to deaf ears? Do we need to speak to each other? What is it that we need to be saying? And so again, for me, the body is actually the place, for me at least, where there's the ability to even reflect on a conversation that needs to happen. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's almost like, you know, what do we need? What do we need? And I often feel that that's something that we experience on a body level.
So you talk about combining expectation, body and voice, and what do we need? And I just wondered, with the fact that you also teach and the continued experience as a teacher, how the teaching has aided your understanding of practice in terms of the different layers and the things that you're talking about. You're saying that maybe we need to understand. How's teaching featured in that? Who's teaching? who's passing on these stories? How has it made you step back and reflect on your body, on your expectations, and the voice that you have through that?
I mean, I really love teaching, and I feel that when I'm teaching, I'm only sharing my learnings in a way, which I suppose all teachers do, but it really is, because it's a constant process, it's a really wonderful opportunity to kind of digest and almost re-understand what you thought you understood, but it helps you kind of reaffirm it in a way. And it also challenges me. It challenges me to really know how deeply what I'm saying I feel, if that makes sense, because it's, you know, it's not easy to say things lightly if they don't really mean something to you. So I think it's a wonderful way of understanding what it is that you're doing more and what it is that matters to you more. And it's interesting because I think obviously, like most people, I started off teaching, you know, like, okay, we're going to do a choreography of fandangos, or we're going to do a buleria. And more, I feel like that is not, you know, there are amazing dancers, flamenco dancers out there, amazing people who will teach you all the choreographies in the world. But I feel more and more that potentially what I could offer, what I'd like to share, is this kind of refinding of our value, of our own different ways of expressing ourselves. So something that is maybe less connected to form, but more embodied in a kind of practice with self, in a, you know, so we do a lot of footwork in flamenco, but now I'm like, wow, it's not, you know, speed, for example, is not so much about speed, but it's about connection. It's about like, how much are you feeling? How much are you engaging your feet in feeling the ground as you do it? Do you know what I mean?
There's that reconnection with earth when you talked about the earthiness that you said you found in other choreographers like Nora, and the groundedness. And so it's almost like when you talk about your body and your body's almost doing it for yourself, it's like those hidden retentions, in terms of African retentions within your body, moving and guiding you for itself. And so it's coming out within your teaching practice, and it's coming out within your dance, even though you've gone down a particular route. Yet those retentions are still there, and that need to be, that groundedness, it's almost that need to be there. But I've got one final question, which actually is quickly becoming a tradition in terms of what we've been doing with the manifesto. And so to end, I'd like to ask you, what is your life lesson that you would want to share with others?
Wow, yeah, this one. I think every time we speak, I'm always like, maybe it'll be different in a, you know, next time we speak. So I feel like it's an ever-changing thing. But I'd say at this moment in time, trusting everything, trusting the universe, trusting self is really important. I feel like it's like we must, you know, so many things are happening. We're all being locked down again, but it's kind of trust and believe is something that I've been saying to myself for a long time. Yeah, I don't know if somebody else could take those words and just help repeat them to themselves, and that they can take on whatever meaning that has for them. But that definitely trust and believe has helped me just to keep plowing, really, to keep going.
I think trust and belief is just absolutely fantastic point to leave it on, because it's also aspirational to have trust and belief and hope. And I think that's a fantastic one to end on. So Yinka, I just need to say, as always, thank you for your time and your words of wisdom. It's really very, very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you so much for including me in this Black Manifesto podcast. It's wonderful. And thank you, Nora, as well.
Thank you for listening. You can read more about Black Manifesto in black ink, a new publication from Serendipity, which brings together international voices from the African and African Caribbean diaspora and Indigenous communities to discuss Black arts, heritage, and cultural politics. In the next episode of Black Manifesto, Nora and I will be joined by Maya Taylor, choreographer and movement director for the next commandment, refuse to dumb it down. Black Manifesto is sponsored by the National Education Union. This podcast was edited by Hannah Hefman and Julia Letts at Better Lemon Creative Audio, with research by Mistura Allison and Amy Grain. For more information and context, visit our Resources for Change pages at serendipity-uk.com.